What is a spiritual awakening? Is it something that can be achieved with effort, or is it simply a gift from grace? Welcome back. My name is Aaron, and this is MindScience episode 22. In today's video, I'd like to help clarify a much misunderstood topic, which is a spiritual awakening. Now, this is a term that gets thrown around very often, and because of that, I think it's important to have a good definition of what it is, because otherwise, we sort of end up talking about two very different things. So let's go ahead and dive into this, and I'll explain what I mean. Many people become interested in spirituality after they hit rock bottom and realize that they desperately need a radical change in their life. So they take up yoga or meditation and start reading spiritual books. Another common way of getting introduced to spirituality is through a friend who might teach them about the law of attraction and how they can create their own reality. And this is certainly a huge step in the right direction. But a spiritual awakening is not when you become introduced to spirituality or begin a spiritual practice. Very simply, a spiritual awakening is when you have the realization, not conceptually but intuitively, that you are not your mind. You discover within yourself that you truly are not the one thinking thoughts, which means that all of your labels are just ideas the mind has created about you and what it thinks that you are. Up until this point, your spirit had essentially been asleep, unconscious of itself. But the mind cannot realize its own unreality. It can only be seen from a deeper dimension. Only the spirit can have this recognition, and this is why it's called a spiritual awakening. This realization will undoubtedly have a profound impact on your normal state of consciousness. You will find it increasingly difficult to label or identify with things. Many people who claim to have already had a spiritual awakening are still completely identified with their mind and have no awareness of who they are beyond their story or their thoughts. And this is because the ego loves spiritual identities more than anything else. They appear to be the most virtuous identities of all, such as, I am a light worker, I'm a starseed, I am a psychic, or an empath. All identities you have about yourself are limitations that will keep you from realizing the infinite joy of your true nature. For many people, the amount of identities actually grows when they find spirituality, and the ego becomes strengthened, protected, and out of sight. Now, all this is perfectly fine, of course, and an equally valid part of one's spiritual journey. But the reason it's important to clarify the difference is because a spiritual awakening is also not the same thing as enlightenment. Many people that have a spiritual awakening believe that they are fully enlightened now. But enlightenment is when all identification with thought has been transcended, and there is no more experience of psychological suffering. A person who has a spiritual awakening almost always has a long road of suffering awaiting them, which we typically call the dark night of the soul. This is when your ego is essentially lashing out at you for realizing that it is an illusion. It's trying to do whatever it can to get you back again. Its goal is to scare you away from progressing towards liberation any further, which of course is impossible. Once you become aware that your body is full of thorns, you are never going to be able to just live your life that way. No matter how bad it hurts, you're going to keep pulling those thorns out until they're all removed. And the same is true for a spiritual awakening. Consciousness can only expand. It can never regress backwards and become unaware of something that it is aware of. In the same way that you can never unwatch a movie that you've already watched. You cannot unsee a spiritual awakening. So whether you like it or not, you are now on the path towards liberation. Now, you may have noticed that I just said, on the path towards liberation. And I use this verbiage simply as a concession to the limitations of the mind, which believes that enlightenment is a path you take. And for the conditioned mind, it actually is. But to say that enlightenment is a path or a journey is a misnomer, because your true self is already perfect and free. It isn't on a path or a journey, and it can't become enlightened. So this begs the question, then what the hell is a spiritual awakening? Who is it that awakens? And the answer is nobody awakens. Quite the paradox, right? So to illustrate what I mean by this, I'll use the following analogy. Let's suppose that an actor named Stephen Smith is playing the character Frodo Baggins in a live Broadway adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. So Stephen Smith gives his performance and then bows with the rest of the cast and receives a standing ovation, and then exits stage left. Now, backstage, the character who plays Samwise Gamgee notices Stephen Smith over in the corner sulking. So he approaches him and says, "Hey man, what's wrong? You gave a spectacular performance. Why do you look so down?" And Stephen Smith says, "Well, Sam, I've lost my right index finger, and so many of my friends perished in battle. I don't know how I'm ever going to recover from the trauma of it all, Sam." Now, his friend looks at him very confused and says, "But you know it was all just a play, right? You're not Frodo Baggins, man. You're Stephen Smith, remember?" But Frodo Baggins isn't buying it. So his friend begins to remind him of Stephen Smith's life. "You were born on this date. You went to this high school, to this college. You work at this place. You're married to this person, remember?" And slowly but surely, Frodo Baggins begins to remember Stephen Smith's life. And then at some point, the realization occurs. I am not Frodo Baggins. I am Stephen Smith. Now, the question is, did Frodo Baggins have an awakening? No. Frodo Baggins can't awaken. Why? Because he isn't real. Only Stephen Smith can awaken. But even Stephen Smith's awakening was really just the remembrance of what has always been true. And in the light of this remembrance, all of Frodo Baggins' problems stop meaning a thing, and Stephen Smith has peace. So what we call a spiritual awakening is really just the experience where the story of me, the psychologically constructed identities, are seen to be an illusion. What sees this illusion? Reality. Reality awakens to itself in the physical form and is then born into a fully lucid experience of space and time and physicality. And in the light of this recognition, the idea of being a separate self disappears. If the idea of being a separate self is an illusion, then the question is, how can that which is unreal appear real? And the answer is only by appearing to that which is real. You are the only reality. So where else can an illusion borrow reality from? The bottom line is that illusions appear real because we believe in them. We are lending our reality to illusions all day long. And as soon as we take that reality back, the illusion vanishes. For this reason, the Course in Miracles says, hallucinations disappear when they are recognized for what they are. This is the healing and the remedy. Believe them not, and they are gone. If the truth has always been here, then why aren't you free now? Why can't you see it clearly? The answer is because you have always been that. So you have no contrast from which to recognize it. How can a fish become aware of water? It knows nothing else. Only by taking the fish out of the water and letting it suffocate and flail, and then placing it back in the water, can the fish know what water is. And the same is true for us. The finite and infinite points of view are diametrically opposed. They cancel one another out. Because of this, you cannot see what you truly are by looking from what you are not. You cannot see your true nature by looking for it as a person. The person isn't capable of seeing it. It can only ever reinforce the person's point of view. You can only see what you are not from the standpoint of what you are. Only awareness can observe the ego. So by consistently observing the activity of your mind without resistance, you begin to know your true nature. The more you recognize what you are not, the more your true nature becomes intuitively understood. There is a dimension in you which has never known suffering. It is pure, uncontaminated. It simply sees. It simply is. All it knows is perfect peace and perfect oneness. It discerns life without judging it. It moves without picking anything up. It cannot be attached to anything because it lacks nothing. The Course in Miracles describes this dimension in you as the Christ and the Son of God. It says, "Now try to reach the Son of God in you. This is the self that never sinned, nor made an image to replace reality. This is the self that never left its home in God to walk the world uncertainly. This is the self that knows no fear, nor could conceive of loss or suffering or death." So, by consistently seeing what you are not, you begin to awaken to what you are. As you see the truth of what you are through the contrast of what you're not, you begin to effortlessly embody that truth. A grace and a humility begins to pour out of you. An inner stillness becomes alive, and a sense of non-attachment to the flow of life. A peace that passes your understanding. Now, oftentimes, being able to see what you're not can be very painful and difficult, because sometimes life needs to deliver us a really hard slap in the face to wake us up to see something that we've been overlooking for so long. But make no mistake, there is always freedom on the other side. So to summarize, you cannot achieve a spiritual awakening by reading enough, or learning enough, or meditating enough, or by any act of effort. But we can let it come to us by simply observing all of the effort that the mind is putting forth to keep you hypnotized to this belief that you're just this person. This is why it's often called in Zen the pathless path, because it requires no time and no effort. The wave does not achieve enlightenment by finding or attaining the ocean, but simply by realizing, I've always been the ocean, and I simply couldn't see it. How much time required? No time. How much effort needed? None. So the dream character cannot wake up from the dream, because the dream character is an action of the dream. Only the dreamer can wake up. So liberation is not an awakening for the person or as the person, but an awakening from the person. It is being dreamt by something much greater, and you are that.